Thank you very much for your presentation. I think it was a great piece of critical anthropology of migration, and as Nikolai is writing in his article on critical anthropology of migration, this discipline must have a capacity to theorize migration in relation to both transnational class politics of human mobility, which routinely transposes a global relation of capital and labor, and the politics of immigration and border policing, as well as a global postcolonial politics of race. And he's also arguing in his articles that we have to shift the anthropology of migration from the uncritical, effectively nativist standpoint of the non-migrant citizen of a migrant receiving nation state, which could only ever reinscribe the global inequalities that geopolitically and juridically produce mobile people who cross state borders as non-citizens, outsiders. So I think it was really the great piece that you are following your kind of conceptual backgrounds. Nicholas has analyzed critically border spectacle in terms of also Anderson, militarization of border enforcement tactics and technologies, and I really love the concept or term, the geography that kills. He has reflected how the targets of these diverse tactics of bordering are overwhelming. Black and brown people immediately confront us with the cruel fact of postcoloniality. Thus, the European asylum system operates as a regime for the production of migrant illegality, so-called migration industry. He remains as not just anthropologist, again, that race is not a fact of nature, indeed race is naturalized. European border regime is set up in a way that does not allow the refugees to be entirely political and autonomous subjects. Sovereign power sees this mobility as a threat to the current order and tries to deny it. By building highly securitized walls and fences, it forces refugees into increasingly dangerous crossings in the hope of dissuading others from even trying, as Nicola has mentioned. Crossing a border is a stepping over a threshold and is being transformed socially and politically, what we also heard. Nicola spoke about disposability of life at the borders of Europe with the deportability of illegalized migrants and refugees. We can also apply the concept of biopolitics here, perhaps, but not in the original Foucault's meaning of population control, but in expanded version of Giorgio Agamben, who is distinguishing two forms of life, better life that humans share with animals based on the Greek concept of zoe and bios, social existence. And the concept of better life is a fundamental to sovereign power, which can produce a state of exception and strip subjects of their social and political existence. And nowadays, it's the refugee and the asylum seeker who primarily instantiate better life, life that is excluded from juridical law and stands outside the police. So my perhaps question for the discussion is how you work with the concept of biopolitics in your work. And my other kind of reflection is linked to my own research question. I'm focusing on care migration. So we are welcoming the other bodies, but not such the other. The ideal of this model is, for example, in the case of Czech Republic, a young white male Eastern European, perhaps from Bulgaria, Romania, with no border regime, but working in precarious conditions of low-paid jobs, and non-EU labor migrants living in their transnational lives without territorialized social system. Or female bodies from Asia who are willing to give a care to our tired bodies in Thai massage salons, or caring for our aging bodies in a live-in service, or even we are selling our privileged European disabled bodies to elderly facilities to the peripheries, like Thailand, in a search of cheap care. Thus, the concept of the body is turning to another dimension. So I would like to just discuss not just neglection of brown and black bodies, but also the privileged situation of white bodies in terms of migration. And then I will open the discussion, of course.
Thanks, Petra. Yeah, I mean, in the interest of the discussion, I'll try to be brief. So I mentioned at a certain point, and this is really the gist of what I want to communicate today in the very title of the presentation, that the power of this deadly border is actually a productive power. And in that sense, I made the point emphatically, it's not only or not purely a necropolitical power, and this formulation of necropolitics, a politics of death, is actually proposed precisely as a kind of counterpoint to Foucault's concept of biopolitics, politics of life. And so in a way, the subtext is precisely that there is a biopolitical power at work here, even as the border becomes more and more deadly, even as the militarization and physical fortification of borders produces an escalation in border crossing deaths. And this, of course, is not only true of the European borders, but also the US border with Mexico and many others around the world. So you have an escalation in the production of the conditions of possibility for migrant deaths, be they in the form of outright killing, which also happens. Some of you may have seen just a few days ago, literally in the last week, a US Border Patrol agent shot a 20-year-old Guatemalan girl in the head who had just crossed the border. These kinds of outright killings are also part of what I'm describing. But so also are the kinds of racist killings that happen on the streets of European cities, far removed from the so-called borders. So there's outright killing, but there also is this much more important, large-scale, systematic production of the conditions of possibility for killing at a distance, killing, killing that doesn't look like killing because no European border agent has laid his hands directly on somebody or shot a gun directly at someone, but rather that you produce the conditions that create more and more deadly crossings and precarious journeys. So while all of this is true, nonetheless, I'm insisting that there is a biopolitics at stake, which is the production. That is that there is, so part of Foucault's point about biopolitics is that it's precisely regulatory, right? That it is about conditioning and producing and cultivating life in various ways. And so the biopolitical character of this increasingly deadly border is precisely in the production and reproduction of a certain kind of category of labor power, the conversion of migrant and refugee lives into the human potential power that's associated with labor. And this is really the larger sort of point that I want to make. And in that sense, that takes a variety of forms, right? The ways in which undocumented or illegalized migrants or refugees become integrated, become incorporated into European societies as precisely the most debased, most subordinate category of labor takes various forms, and one of which is precisely care work, which is overwhelmingly gendered as female work, because it tends to operate in the more informalized portions of the economy, but it also takes the form of farm labor. For example, many of the vegetables on our tables are produced in farms in southern Europe that are completely worked by migrant labor forces, right? And it takes the form of house cleaning and so many other kinds of work that are less regulated. So again, partly I want to sort of emphasize that biopolitical character that comes with producing the conditions of possibility for sustaining in a more or less prolonged or permanent way a migrant condition that has very little access to any form of regularization, legalization. That means that once people get across, that they've risked their lives, they've endured sometimes hardships and suffering over an extended period, sometimes as long as 10 years in transit, to get to European soil, then it becomes unthinkable to leave. It becomes unfathomable to risk having to go through those conditions again. And so people become captives and locked into various kinds of labor market positions. And you're raising a whole other interesting conversation about the ways in which that means that the reliance upon this migrant labor, the dependency increasingly upon this migrant labor, oftentimes takes a very intimate form, right? And it means that there's a very, a very domestic character, particularly in the case of care work for aging European bodies, and that need to greater or lesser extents this kind of personalized care that many times falls through the cracks of an increasingly neoliberalized series of welfare state systems that don't provide that care adequately. You have then this surrogate or supplement that comes in the form of illegalized migrant workers who are there to provide that care. But that kind of caring labor for the European elderly, for example, is intimately connected also to the work that is done when people are hired to clean houses. That is also very often directly or indirectly connected also to sex work. And so you have a whole variety of, to use an expansive understanding of the idea of care, a whole variety of forms of work that come to be exclusively the preserve of illegalized migrants. And again, we should be reminded that for decades, European economists have been trumpeting the demographic decline of Europe and the necessity of migration. And this indeed is the way in which a form of migrant labor has been systematically produced under the conditions that are precisely most advantageous to employers, most disadvantageous for those who may suffer the legal recriminations of their so-called illegal condition and their susceptibility, their vulnerability to the recriminations of the law, up to and including, of course, detention and deportation. So with that, I'll just try to open it up.
Mm-hmm. So now there's a time for discussion. We have a microphone here, so.
I would like to thank you for your wonderful presentation, and it was really over-comprehensive, and it was a pleasure to listen to you. And my question is very specifically related to your mention to anti-discrimination without race. If you can talk more about anti-discrimination without race and how we can include race as a legal category without reproducing the racialization of people that are affected by this form of discrimination. Thank you.
My question is also very much related to that. Maybe I could pose it first, because it is. I think that when you were saying that we have to introduce, if we do not introduce race as an analytical category, then we are reproducing racism. But it is in a way, why as an analytical category, and how then in a way reproduce racism or race as a basic category. It is, of course, I understand you fully in terms of how racialization works, but what is the line between racialization and then introducing race as an analytical category, and very much in that kind of the line where whether we are not themselves falling prey. Thank you.
Are there some other questions? Perhaps not now, or? I see.
Can I wait for the next round?
It's okay. Listen to the microphone.
Well, maybe just briefly, I wanted first to comment on this same topic of race, and just also ask how to deal with the possible unwillingness of some migrants themselves to be racialized. And for example, I think that some Syrians and Iraqis themselves might not think of themselves as racialized subjects, or at least not until they are racialized in the process of migration. And I remember this late summer of 2015 seeing European tourists coming back, and many of them darker skinned after all their nice tans than a lot of the migrants they were complaining about. But my main question was how, I really appreciated the way you presented the migration regime as a kind of production of labor power and the working class, in a sense. These classic economic categories are produced through these border regimes. And I wanted to ask to what extent we can apply the same kind of conceptualization to capital, and how that might understand the way that not only classic right-wing critiques of migration are expressed as racial anger, but also how it comes into a kind of truncated leftist discourse, or even someone like Trump will use this kind of present himself as a perverse critic of international finance and the defender of the hard-working people, but especially in the Czech Republic and a lot of parts of Central Europe, anti-migrant discourse has also become inflected in a kind of anti-capital discourse, where capital is identified with this the migration regime, not only labor but also capital.
Thank you very much.
Shall I? Yeah. It seems like the other mic is working better than this one.
Yeah, it's somehow broken.
No, thank you for these questions. Maybe I'll start with the last one first, because I think it raises a very important point, that one very problematic kind of politics of class, or a kind of leftist discourse, reproduces a set of nativist assumptions, and indeed can sometimes fashion itself as somehow a defense of native workers or native workers' jobs against migrants, and even fashion itself as an anti-capitalist discourse. So I think that's a very crucial political question, that we see this peculiar kind of discursive blurring between right-wing, racist, anti-immigrant discourses and various kind of would-be left discourses that, in a kind of simple-minded anti-capitalism, actually, kind of collude with the same kinds of anti-immigration positions. So, I mean, it raises a series of very large questions. One of which is the notion that somehow capitalism is actually pro-immigration, that capitalism somehow works toward an ideal of perfect human mobility on command and at the disposal of capital for the purposes of exploitation, and that therefore somehow capital is opposed to borders. I think that's a mistaken and misguided conception, because what borders do, just as the state does, is it mediates the capital-labor relation. And indeed, much of what I'm describing is precisely about the mediation of a global relation between capital and labor through border policing and border enforcement and immigration law, as well as asylum law. It mediates that relation by using the law to intervene in the production of new kinds of social and political categories, and in effect branding particular categories of labor as foreign, as non-citizen, as illegal, etc. Right? So in that sense, the productivity that I've been describing, the productivity of these kinds of borders from the point of view of the reproduction of migrant labor power and its exquisite vulnerability to the recriminations of the law, is only possible to the extent that you have this contradictory production of the apparent exclusion, the ostensible exclusion of people through their illegalization, at the same time as it is simultaneously about their subordinate inclusion as precisely those who are more vulnerable to the recriminations of the law, more vulnerable to any encounter with law enforcement, and in that sense produced as so much the more likely to be docile as labor. Right? So in that sense, we have to recognize labor as always simultaneously for capital as well as against capital. And for the greater part of the time, labor is produced and reproduced precisely as for capital, effectively subordinated to the requirements of capital. And so in that sense, the state, and particularly that aspect of the state which is about the production of borders and immigration policing, then does this crucial work of contributing to that subordination in very specific ways. So in that sense, it's, I think, naive to propose that somehow capitalism is pro-migration or anti-border, because, of course, capital is simply interested in the most effective and efficient subordination and exploitation of labor. And that can take a variety of forms depending on the terms and conditions of the state of struggle and the state of play between labor and capital. When migrant workers become insubordinate, they quickly, capitalist employers quickly opt for other alternatives. But the use of these bordering techniques and technologies and tactics contribute to the production of migrant labor as a particularly vulnerable and therefore more likely docile kind of labor force. But of course, in reality, migrant workers are oftentimes those who become the most militant. So that in 2006 in the United States, for example, we saw an absolutely unprecedented social movement, overwhelmingly made up of migrants and their children, disproportionately made up of the working poor, so overwhelmingly working class in its composition, also overwhelmingly people of color, an absolutely unprecedented movement that mobilized literally millions of people in virtually every city across the United States in a very short period of time, and that in rapid motion completely subverted a proposed law that would have been the most punitive immigration legislation in US history. The sheer insurgency of migrant communities, as well as the children of migrants, really derailed completely that proposed anti-immigrant legislation. And so, you know, and similarly, we could look at the history of labor organizing, which many times is spearheaded by migrant workers. So it's not to suggest at all that somehow that these tactics are guaranteed success in the subordination of that labor. It's only to suggest that this is a crucial way in which the state, through the law and through various kinds of policing, mediate that relation between capital and labor. And when it doesn't work, of course, then capital will opt for other alternatives. But the other thing about these kind of myopic articulations of a class politics on the basis of anti-immigrant hostility is that they imagine falsely that there's such a thing as a national economy. They imagine falsely that somehow jobs are a resource to be protected, and that jobs can be the exclusive preserve of the nation, and that somehow the so-called native workers can somehow be protected against the challenge or threat or competition of so-called foreign workers. And we know that this is a complete falsehood. It's a complete illusion. That capital has operated on a global scale since its inception, since the 16th century. Capital has been global, and so of course you have different kinds of capitalists, different kinds of particular employers who have greater or lesser wherewithal to operate, on a global scale or a local scale or a national scale, and therefore competing interests among different capitalists as well, which play themselves out in part in the disputes over immigration law. Different interests among different kinds of capitalists who have greater or lesser capacities. But capital as such operates on a global scale and will go wherever it can realize a profit. And in that sense, the relation between capital and global needs to be understood as a global one that then borders and immigration law serve to mediate in the way that I've been describing. So in the interest of time, I'll keep moving. But the important point then is to say that what I'm calling nativism, anti-immigrant politics, are not reducible to so-called xenophobia, are not reducible only to the most racist kinds of expression of a hostility to foreigners, but indeed are precisely an identity politics that is about the promotion and the priority of the interests of the so-called natives. And I call it an identity politics because it promotes the interests and prerogatives and priorities of the so-called natives on no other grounds than that they are natives. Right? So it's an intrinsic part of the way that nationalism works. It needs to produce a people in its own image, which is to say in the image of the state, and it needs to pretend that there is some kind of true native that can be protected through this kind of politics. So to come back to the question of race, I appreciate these questions because I think these also are really crucial and vital questions. The dilemma that I'm interested in here is to really insist on our capacity to think critically and analytically with a category of race that is, that is sufficiently capacious and agile and flexible to contend with the realities of racialization. A lot of racialization in its contemporary form takes an overtly, apparently deracialized or race-neutral form, right? There are discourses about Muslims, for example, which are plainly racist discourses, but they appear to be about something else. And this is part of what I was using the quote from the spokesperson from the Pier in France to refer to, the ways in which certain kinds of categories that might appear, for example, to be about religion, in fact are not fundamentally about religion, they're about the racialization of various categories of people. Similarly, discourses of crime, discourses, so we've seen very quickly, almost with lightning speed, in the aftermath of the so-called refugee crisis, the conversion of the refugee into a figure of terrorist threat, the conversion of the figure of the refugee into the threat of sexual predator. All of these things happened, within a matter of weeks and months. And so the discourses of terrorism and securitization in that respect, the discourses of sexual predators a kind of broader discourse of cultural difference smuggles in a variety of ways in which these kinds of hostility are predicated on things that appear to be about culture, right? And this is why I think it's so crucial to understand that it is absolutely insufficient to imagine that race actually names some kind of natural thing that is somehow pre-cultural or acultural, that somehow race and culture can be opposed to each other as separate categories, right? I'm insisting on the fact that race, in every iteration that it has ever had, even in its most purely biological iterations, in the most inane sorts of racist scientific racism from the 19th century, always was cultural, always produced not only a notion about who they are and what they are, but how they are, so to speak. Right? It was always a discourse of cultural difference, of social difference, that was coupled, inherently conjoined with some notion about some pure quasi-biological, pseudo-objective description of difference among categories of people. And so race is always naturalized, produced as if it could name something that was biological, but is always inherently about cultural and social constructions of difference as well, in a way that needs to be first and foremost located in its context of unequal power and wealth and prestige, that is to say, in its political context. So I think that we need the category of race to do that analysis of racialization, even when racialization appears to not be overtly about something that looks like race in its old-fashioned form. I think that otherwise you get a kind of, it's like the old adage about pornography. We know it when we see it, right? So people can embrace a certain anti-racist politics that naively sort of says, well, we're against racism. We know racism is bad, and we know it when we see it. But the racists, of course, have a very overt essentialist commitment to an idea of racial difference. And the people who are the victims of racism also know that it's about race, right? So there's no question for the people who are the objects and the victims of racism that it's about race. But then we need a complex and critical language analytically that allows us to call it by its name, to identify it, in order to then have a kind of anti-racism that is not simply a kind of knee-jerk reflex that says, oh, it's bad to discriminate against people because they're different. Again, part of the problem there is that it then falls back into a complacent relationship to that notion of difference. That then risks reinscribing the production of that difference as if it were natural. Oh, those people are just different because they look different, they have different skin color, different hair, different whatever it is about their bodies. So there's a way that we need an analytical category that can allow us to interrogate precisely those productions of difference that are so easily naturalized and that tend to be always renaturalized and restabilized as if they somehow named something real and objective in the biological sense, right? Of course, I want to hasten to say race is deeply real, more real than anything biological. It's not real in a biological sense. It's much more real than that because it has the consequences of life and death, because it's a social fact. And social facts are infinitely more powerful and meaningful and consequential than any fact of biology.
Thank you very much.